Hello, I'm Jenya DeLima. Welcome to Writing and Editing, the author-focused podcast that takes a whole-person approach to everything related to both writing and editing. When we're thinking about how to start a story and looking for advice, we might be told to think first of our characters or maybe our plot. But what about letting the setting lead the way? Daniel Braum is an author and the host of Nighttime Logic, and he's going to share how, why, and when to use setting as your story's structure. Well, first, it is always a complete joy to chat with you, and I'm so glad you're here.
Great chatting with you. Thanks for having me on the program.
hmm Would you like to start by telling us something about yourself and what you write?
Yeah, my name's Daniel Braum. I tend to write mostly, or I publish mostly short stories. I guess a good pop culture touchstone for the kind of short stories I write. You might think of those old Twilight Zone TV
Oh,
shows.
yes.
I publish mostly in horror with publishers such as Cemetery Dance Publications, but I'm on the borderlands or the outliers, the outlying edge of horror. I call a lot of my work strange tales in
Oh,
homage to British author Robert Aikman, because a lot of my work is intended to be that kind of psychological horror, almost like a Rorschach, where two different people can look at something and there might be intentionally ambiguous supernatural elements in it.
yes, I would agree with all of that just from the one collection I've read.
Thank you.
So I'd love to hear how you define setting as structure and what this means to you.
Well, I can tell you what it means for me. I always like to be cautious with my advice, and I think giving advice just in general or specifically, at least for me, is intended to be like a tool in a
Yeah.
tool bag and not like oh, if you don't write 5,000 words, you're not an author, which. So for me, setting, it seems to be the part on both ends of the spectrum. On one end, it's the part that I think you can't teach or you can't control. And what I mean by that is that's where, for me, the inspiration or that magic part of why I want to write comes from. On
hmm
the other end, I feel like setting maybe the part of the story, at least for me, that maybe gets the short end of the stick, and
Yeah.
maybe people either intentionally leave out or our beginners are taught to leave out. Like after all, there's that maxim: don't describe sunsets. Okay, that's great beginner writing advice, and maybe even great advice in general. But I feel like maybe we get conditioned as authors to not use setting as fully as we'd like.
Yes.
So for me, after publishing for a while and doing interviews and asking that question, like, oh, about inspiration or process, I realized that yeah. So first comes the inspiration. We want to write. We've decided to sit down and write a story. I guess there's planners and pantsers. I'm very much a planner. I like to have that story told in my mind, or I like to be able to verbally tell a story to a friend or a
Mhm.
colleague before I sit down on paper. But while I'm planning that story, there's often that bit of inspiration, a place or a thing in a place, something very, very setting specific.
Mhm.
But at least mostly we can't just describe that sunset or describe that forest or describe that object. So the setting is the part that you can't control for me. And then I start the process, I guess, or it would be the writer's tool in for writers listening in that toolbox. So to me, I take the setting and I start to think of, well, the character comes second to that, and also the conflict either comes second or third or simultaneously. I think of what will be the best way to manifest this bit of
Oh,
inspiration
right.
in dramatic structure. And for me, dramatic structure is characters with conflicts, dynamic characters. That's what I mean when I say setting as structure. I think it's more. I think it'd be more apt to say setting creating the structure or setting
Yes.
specific structure.
Right. And I was thinking too about your most recent short story collection and how you sometimes see not just how the setting has changed, but how people within that setting change over time when they've left it and then returned to it. And so you're using those elements all together. So it's not just this isolated view of we're going to be looking at setting or we are just going to be looking at this jungle or this beach. No, you're looking at how it interplays with everything else and how it does bring about that character change or growth.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, that the book that she just mentioned is Creatures of Liminal Space, which should be out now or out soon from Jack and Apes Press. Yeah, often I do want to write about place, and I think you picked up on it, whether it's intentionally or subconsciously that happens.
Hmm.
Both characters and points of change, which I think makes for great dynamic structure. And often I find myself writing about places themselves that may be in points of change,
Yes.
or as well.
Right. And with some of them too, you can't really imagine it taking place anywhere else. That setting has to be that setting or the story no longer works. And I think so often we're able to, I always think of those sliding backdrops that you would see like in high school plays, where you could just move out like, Henry the Eighth or whatever and throw in Antony and Cleopatra's background and it wouldn't really matter because there's no focus at all on the background. But that's not true with what's happening here.
Oh, that's really, really well said. Both about how, yeah, the story must exist in that place, and now I can't unsee setting as sliding background like a Met opera or a wonderful high school play. Great, great point there.
Yes. Well, on the flip side, I'd also like to hear your opinion about what setting a structure doesn't mean, or maybe even how some people mistakenly define it.
Wow, I'd be honored if anyone would even would mistakenly define it or define it at all. Yeah, I'm not sure. I guess I can only speak for myself because it's just one tool in the tool bag. On the other hand, on the spectrum of authors of setting forward stories or setting forward authors, if it could be such a thing. On the one hand, two of my earliest influences were Lucius Shepard and Kenneth Lee. So before I even knew character conflict or setting, or before I even really had a deep dive into knowing what setting was or thinking about it as a reader, I just was into those stories where, like you said, the story couldn't take place somewhere else, or when you got done reading the story, you felt like you went somewhere. The setting was a character in itself. On the other end of the spectrum, maybe we have authors that I enjoy almost equally, like a Hemingway with the very tight,
Um,
controlled prose, and he could do things in a sentence or just a word, with setting as well. So I'm twisting the word mistake, but maybe I'm just changing the question around to just say like, yeah, it's more of a spectrum. There really are no mistakes. It's just intent and how you want to color your story.
yeah, but I think the key word there that you just used is intent. So
Yeah,
yes, if you have this richly imagined landscape, but then you just say the sun was yellow, well, you've missed your intent. It hasn't come across on the page. So yeah, I think that's one thing to just keep in mind that entire time. But also, how much of a part are you wanting the setting to play? Do you want the setting to be something that people not necessarily notice, but understand is necessary?
yeah. In one of the stories in Creatures of Liminal Spaces called Phantom Constellations, and when I was reviewing it, there's one small part of the story where it does take place over time, and the character is in a different setting. He's in New York, when most of the setting takes place elsewhere. And I noticed that little passage, where it was pointed out to me, the setting in that little passage was simply what I call, or what is called, white room. There was almost no setting details at all. Like, it was clear to the reader that it was New York, but the
Mm-hmm.
setting in New York was not intended to be anything there other than it was intended to show a passage of time. So I just noticed, to me, and we get a vote of confidence from one of our four-legged friends,
I'm
and
gonna leave that in.
yes, there should be dogs in this setting. But yeah, so I guess the opposite of a rich setting could be, a white room. And white room doesn't necessarily have to be a dirty word. I think it
Mm-hmm.
can be when it causes unclarity, like the wrong
Oh,
kind of
yes.
clarity and the wrong kind of ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean, yeah, I guess what I mean by that is just having the reader not, be out of the story or not feel grounded in the story or stray far from the author's intent.
Right. And what part do you think that genre plays in that?
Wow, I mean, genre is just the fun of genre came to mind in there because you don't have to be grounded by reality. So yeah, you have someone like Tanith Lee where they could have a city that doesn't necessarily have to be grounded in exact reality. Or in genre, a lot of authors do use secondary worlds and
Mm-hmm.
can build their own world, with its own. I think setting will have a lot to do with creating that. Or even in the corner of genre that I write in horror, weird fiction, strange tales, whatever genre label we want to use at any given time.
I was thinking
Uh,
quiet horror, but yes.
Quiet, yeah, yeah, quiet, yeah. So quiet. Let's use quiet horror. I think quiet horror has a lot to do. with atmosphere. So
Mhm.
setting, so using, the haunted house genre, or even just the quiet house story, where the setting and those parts of the story that we relegate or identify as setting do a lot in creating that. It's
Yeah.
definitely a tool that I think people who come in, you're coming into an atmospheric story, or a Halloween story, or a ghost story, or a quiet horror story. I think both the author intends to put that part of setting forward, and I think readers also are wanting, expecting, and craving to have setting
Mhm.
forward there.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are certain genres where you almost have to let setting play that huge part because otherwise readers might come away feeling like it's lacking something. And I was especially thinking of fantasy and sci-fi with world building because they want something different from what they experience every day in their normal lives. But without world building and without those setting details, it's going to feel like it's not really in someplace new, it's just in some place.
Thinking of a very famous author, I think his name is Snoopy, with his famous opening line, "It was a dark and stormy night."
Yes, what a classic. Maybe that'll be the
don't
title of this episode.
don't try this at home, kids.
Well, do you think there are ever signs for an author that indicate that setting as structure should be the right choice for a story or maybe isn't the right choice?
That's a great question. I guess I did contemplate that in that part of a story, since I use it so much, and when I find myself not using it, I certainly second guess that and make it conscious and start evaluating it. Maybe it has to do with perspective on that one. So like maybe I'm thinking of, like, I'll probably misuse the Joseph Campbell quote, but something that's very specific to us here. We're writing and editing and broadcasting from America, so the details of our ordinary life, which might be the sort of thing that might seem like the sort of thing that you would want to edit out or remove from a story, to a non-American reader or just someone who's not there, those sort of details make for exactly the sort of thing that we're looking for when we go to a quote unquote, for us, an exotic setting. I'd never been to India or some places or cities there. So if I actually want those mundane details and those
Hmm.
descriptions that might instinctively, or might, whatever the might on the nose, people might say, oh, take those out. I'm like, no, like I want to see that tree, I want to smell that food, I want to see how you got from here to there. Whereas the instinct might be like, oh yeah, let's trim that out.
Ah, yeah, I can see exactly what you're saying because I was thinking too, I've seen this come up a lot, and I think I've talked about it in a prior episode when they were talking about the classic American 50s diner, or now we have the retro diners that are meant to recreate that experience. Whereas here we gloss over those descriptions because everyone assumes that they know what they're like, or the same with the drive-in theater, even though they're rapidly disappearing. But yeah, someone who's never experienced one of those places or been to one in real life and their whole knowledge about it only comes from media that they've imported from another country. So yeah, that's a great point. But I think that also indicates that you should be aware of where your audience might be located.
Yeah, I don't know how much should be in there, but I think it's one of the things that writing can do. And we're talking about intent. It's one of the things that we can do intentionally to preserve places, or serendipitously. Like I guess I've been writing 20, 25 years from now, and some of the places that I had written about early in my career don't exist anymore or have
Yeah.
changed. And I did not intend that, although now in retrospect, it seems to be perhaps a not intended but very valuable aspect of the story. Like, wow, I preserved a little piece of something unintentionally that, yeah, you can't go out there and observe it right now. And I
Oh,
think that's
yeah.
a wonderful thing that any genre of writing can do. So yeah, maybe I have more awareness of that at this
Yeah.
point as a writer.
No, I love that. And I was even thinking about, I think it was with you, we were talking about those old cartoons and the TV ads and things. Not that that's, well, I mean, that's part of setting, right? And when you see those things and you think, oh yeah, I remember that toy, or oh yeah, I remember when McDonald's looked like this, or this is what the playground used to be like, and we had this kind of slide instead of this kind of slide. But yeah, there are all those details when you're living with it in the moment. You think, does this really matter? Do I need to include this? Everyone's going to know exactly what this is like. But yeah, we need to think of setting as something dynamic because it is. And I think there's a Victor Hugo quote where he talks about how man destroys things faster than anything else. And one of the examples he uses is an old church and how they might decide that we're going to clear this away and make room for something else. And so it brings that to mind too, that this foundational piece that we assume will be here forever just because in our very small, short, limited lifespan, it has been there forever. But we're overlooking that very real possibility that it might not be someday soon.
I think it's a great point and a great example that you said, like the old cartoon or any old or date specific piece of television. I think
Mhm.
perhaps more in film than in fiction, although I think it happens in fiction as well. That's certainly used. Like in film, all the time, they use what's on the TV as either, theme or to quickly date something. So maybe I'll use that as the answer to the question I passed and said we'll get back to it. When should someone be using setting a structure? And I
Mhm.
think if you find yourself using those shortcuts both can be both effective in quickly dating something, but if you're not from that time, it could completely leave you on the outside of it. So that's why it goes the same with music. Like I caution when using any sort of a shortcut to try to get beneath the surface level of that. But I would caution people to not just use it as like a date stamp, although you could, and to try to move it a click forward, get to the character of that, or get to the theme of that, and try to tie setting into point of view or emotional resonance. I think makes it even stronger. So to say, well, how are these mistakes? There are no mistakes, but there are different levels or qualities or renderings of setting that we can, think about.
Yeah. And so, how do you think an emphasis on setting can change a story? Let's say if you did have that white wall effect going and now you've added in something else, what's going to be different about this story?
Yeah, I think it could simply change the reading experience. Yeah, and it can come just right down to preference. Some people, hey, do you prefer Hemingway or do you prefer someone with a more rendered sense of prose? So it could simply just be like the sensual experience of how much do you like your senses to be engaged and
Hmm.
or not engaged. For some people, yeah, we're talking about the fantasy setting. I'm thinking about Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time. That was a series that was maybe 20 years ago. I so many people were recommending it to me that I actually read it, and I was struck by how much setting. Like, there's just so much setting going on there, and I'm just reminded of how that was an element. It seemed to be like all the writers I knew would criticize Jordan and they would call it fat fantasy. Like, oh my God, like it's a doorstop. All this stuff needed to be trimmed. But when I asked every reader how they felt about Robert Jordan, they
Hmm.
felt the exact opposite. They were like, well, what do you like about
Ah.
this book? They were like, I like how they have lunch. They could care less about the plot and the tightness, which not
Right.
that they could care less, but to them it's secondary. They're like, yeah, I'm not so sure I care how it ends up. I want to spend time here with these people. So I feel like
Mhm.
if you highly edit Robert Jordan, it's like perhaps if I was his editor, I would shake him around and smash him around, but not really. But yeah, so how would it change it? You could really take the joy out of it for people who just want that immersion. And now that I think about it, maybe that was exactly what young me was getting, why early Tanith Lee and Lucia Shepard was firing for me. Because in addition to these plots, in addition to these ideas in my young mind, I actually had this sense of immersion and these places
Yeah.
where I'd never been yet, will never be, or in the case of Tanith Lee, no one will ever be because they only exist in that secondary world of her imagination.
Yes, exactly. Well, looking more at maybe contemporary fiction, but historical fiction as well too. But what about setting as mood?
That goes right back to It's a Dark and Stormy Night. Like I think the
Yes. Oh,
Gothic
Snoopy.
got yeah, oh Snoopy, Gothic fiction and quiet horror and all sorts of that, really setting does a lot of the heavy lifting for
Hmm.
those sorts of things. And we might, again, yeah, we might feel a little bit our expectations weren't met or not as satisfying a snack. Like if our Gothic story was not set in there. Maybe that goes to the issue of meeting, playing, or subverting expectations, but that could be a whole other topic for another time.
That's true. Yeah, I was thinking that too, especially those I used to read a lot of the Gothic novels from the early mid 1800s. If you don't have like creaking stairs and the
Yeah,
moss covered damp stones, and what are you even doing? Well, have you ever written something where setting really wasn't playing a big role, and then as you were revising and editing, perhaps you added it in for that extra little touch?
I'd have to think about that. Nothing is coming to mind. But yeah, now that I'm thinking about it, I did there. Some of the stories I write are more on the nose science fiction, and there was one story I wrote. It's out of print right now. It was called Mile Zero, and it was about. It actually was before this current political cycle. Maybe it was 20 years ago, but it was a story of a woman who was trying to escape the United States. It was the United States where many totalitarian things had come to pass, and things having to do with autonomy of the body, like having chips or identification in the body. And she wasn't actually traveling to have an abortion. She was traveling because she wanted her child to live free of this sort of thing. So a lot of it took place in southern Florida. And maybe like the intent of the story wasn't to say something about southern Florida, but the intent of the story was to say about these political aspects. But maybe I don't remember writing it, but that would be the sort of thing where I could imagine myself writing the non-setting stuff first and probably rendered
Oh,
it secondary, only to maybe avoid what I would call like that white room syndrome. And in that
right.
case would be to then bolster the story to make it feel like it is in a real populated place, not just like she's here, they're here, they're there. And I think that's a great place to use the topic of, yeah, right, just enough setting there to make it feel
Mhm.
populated and bolster the reality.
And how do you have any suggestions for creating a setting that feels fully formed and yet like it's a fundamental part of the story? And I'm just going to toss in that you managed to do this with stories that are only a few pages long, so I know that you know how to do it.
We can mention creatures of the liminal space again because
Yes, let's do it.
yeah, and like there's a juxtaposition in this book. Three of the stories might be called novelettes. I'm
Mhm.
not sure the
Yeah,
official, but long short stories of the higher end of the word count. So you have a lot more room to play with and more expectation, of immersion. And those three stories are framed in a frame or a setting, different sense of the word, like a gemstone setting of flash fiction pieces, all of them which are stories of 500 to 1,000 words a piece. So it's a very different crafting those things.
yeah.
I think the common element for me, I like go towards the specific and
Mm,
not the generic. And even if
mhm.
it is and if we are using the generic, then to tie it to the point of view or the emotional, something, have it do double duty or have it do something other than being present, have it
Ah,
delivering the setting in a way that's most organic to the story if possible,
yeah,
I guess detective stories I tend not to write about that kind of stuff, but you have a get out of jail free card if you have a character whose natural point of view or natural inclination is to observe. When we
right.
have other characters, then it's kind of like, all right, the Supreme Court definition of pornography, you will know it if I see it. But yeah, you want to have it feel organic to the character.
Yeah, that brings up an important point too, and this is something that I always include in my world building webinar, that you need to be thinking about your character within that setting. What are they likely to notice? What are they not likely to notice? Even how their career, their hobbies, their personal interests, how that's all going to also play a part in the things that stand out to them.
Yeah, and even in some cases, I'm writing a lot of my stories when the settings are quote unquote exotic or non-American settings. A lot of them are outsiders,
Mhm.
so it sort of makes sense of how certain things would come across or be noticed or be perceived as fantastic. On the flip end
Mhm.
of that, I do have some stories that are written about local people, so that you just get a different set of tools and how to deliver that, and a different point of view and a different meaning to
Yeah.
perhaps even the same things.
Well, before we end, can you name a book or a movie that you think expertly uses setting as structure?
That one's real easy. Now, it would be the short story "The Jaguar Hunter" by Lucius Shepard. I guess it could be found in his short story collection of the same name.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. And be sure to check out the show notes for additional information, including all of Dan's links. And then please join me next week when author Randy Lyman will explain how emotional disconnection could be blocking your success. Thanks again.